Hello, it is Blue Orange 22. Welcome to our Friday weekly voice chat. This is the Men Are Human Discord server. We are the semi official Discord server of the Men's Rights subreddit. This week's topic is going to be Title IX and the problems with Title IX and some of the issues that MRAs have with Title IX when it comes to gender discrimination and the differences in how male and female students are treated. We have a special guest, MRA Title IX. So he is going to be talking in depth about some of the issues that Title IX has and some of the negative consequences that it has. Just to be clear, this I don't want because we don't want this to be spun into something that we're not saying. We're not saying we are against the existence of federal laws to ensure gender equality in the university system. So what we're not saying is, oh, we're against women's education and we're against girls having opportunities. What we're saying is the way Title IX is written and executed has consequences. So MRA Title IX, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thanks. I really appreciate you guys getting this set up for me. It's a particularly passionate topic for me. So Title IX is a pretty short civil rights law that was passed in the early 70s, and it's a U.S. civil rights law that says no person in the United States shall, based on sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any educational program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. That's it. That's the entirety of what is Title IX. A lot of legal manuals and things have precipitated from that. So the Department of Justice has a legal manual that you can find online, and that will apply to all federal agencies. The Department of Justice allows the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights to have its own regulations due to this being particularly relevant to them. And so the Department of Education has their own funding rules called 34 CFR 106. And so it's like Title IX plus. It's got a bunch of extra hoops and stuff to it, but it includes Title IX. And there's a couple of points that we need to understand when discussing Title IX that people typically misinterpret. Federal financial assistance does not mean the government buying like products at market rate. It means the government providing better than market rates when purchasing things or engaging in activities. So when schools take federal loans, which have better rates and better terms than private loans, that counts as federal financial assistance. The PPP loans that the Small Business Administration issued due to COVID, that triggers Title IX compliance. So if you're a small business that took those loans, you have to be compliant with Title IX. And when we see sex discussed in terms of civil rights law, a recent Supreme Court case had retroactively determined that sex does not just mean biological sex, it includes gender identity and sexual orientation. So when we say sex, that's what we mean. And if we mean biological sex, we have to specify that. Right? And under Title IX, it only talks about discrimination based on sex. And it doesn't just apply to schools, it applies to businesses. If the institution is primarily education related, like a university, Title IX is a little bit more expansive and actually applies to like their hiring practices in the institution as a whole. Whereas if it was applying to a corporation that took some federal financial assistance, it would really only apply to any educational program that they run. So just a little bit of bumpers on that. Uh, Under Title IX, it was determined, like in the aftermath, that sexual harassment occurring on campuses did constitute sex discrimination. So they added a bunch of extra provisions to OCR's funding rules to handle that. And that ended up dominating a lot of the discussion because it's a pretty contentious issue where we have the executive branch setting the rules, regulation, enforcement of something that Congress never passed. They didn't pass those funding rules. And um, now we've established courts and stuff in schools, and there's kangaroo court issues. And this always dominates the discussion because it's a pretty incendiary topic. And the issues of discrimination as it was originally talked about with Title IX doesn't appear anymore. Nobody's addressing these problems. And there's a couple of us out here that are trying to make change, and there's real paths to do that, but it's not going to happen if we don't talk about it, which is what motivated this talk today. A good example, and this is a complaint I filed recently, was against Barnard College. So there's a couple of universities in the U.S. that still admit people based on their gender, and Barnard's one of them. It's a women-only college, and when after both are in 2015, the college revised its gender admissions policy to include trans women, and they failed to recognize that in Title IX, they can only continue a one-sex admissions policy if that one-sex admission policy is consistent since the time of the organization or the school being founded. So the moment they changed it, they no longer have an exception to it. And we see these really obvious violations where you wonder if anybody actually even looked at Title IX when making these decisions. And in looking into it, I realized that there's no real mandated training on Title IX that falls outside of the sexual harassment umbrella. These Title IX coordinators and Title IX staff that we see at universities, there's no mandated qualifications or minimum bar that they have to meet to serve in these roles. They never get educated on these, or they don't are, they're not required to have training on discrimination in their educational programs, only the sexual harassment stuff. And if you look at their training materials, it's reflected there. So when we see these flagrantly discriminatory practices, it's partly a result of OCR not mandating training and the staff not being aware of it. But as members of the United States, we have an interesting ability to file complaints with the Office of Civil Rights. So if we write complaints to them and we explain why programs are in violation, it prompts action and it gets these programs changed. But nobody's doing it if we don't. Nobody's going to be proactive about it, not the staff, not OCR. So that's where my activism is I file a lot of complaints. I have, I think, over 20 active complaints right now, and 5 or 6 of them are currently in the investigative phase. So I'm really interested to see where those go. So I'll let other people talk now if they would like.
So all your complaints are on Title IX, but Title IX has issues that you guys are complaining about?
Yeah, the law itself, as it was written, I don't have any issues with. I think it's a great law. It's the issue of selective enforcement. When OCR is really the enforcement arm of Title IX primarily, because they deal with the educational system. And when it comes to men's cases, they frequently dismiss them using straw man arguments, like they'll just ignore critical components of evidence. A good example is a case I had against Texas A&M, where after a year and a half of review, they dismissed it without a single reference to law. And it was so egregious that it actually prompted involvement of a federal senator sending papers and documents to OCR, which actually prompted them to actually begin working on my appeal for it. It was that bad, and they do this, and when they do actually do something about men's cases, there's no actual deterrent in their resolutions. at max, all they're going to do is make the school change the program. There's no admission of guilt. There's no like monetary penalties, like oh yeah, you got to give like back, I don't know, 30,000 to OCR or something, and nobody's required to be fired. So it's basically a legal position that these Title IX staff are serving in, and there's no recourse for them violating it. So schools just do it. There's no deterring effect to them instituting these programs. So you can take a look around, pick pretty much any American university, and you'll find women in STEM programs, like women only awards, women only mentoring programs, women only summer camps, things like that. I mean, I'm filing a complaint right now against a university that explicitly admitted to having gender quotas for some of their like laboratories and stuff, which is another flagrant violation of Title IX. And they were using this in advertising materials. So it's OCR's lack of attention and action that precipitates these flagrant violations. And it's definitely intentional on OCR's part.
All right, thanks.
Anybody in the U.S. Can file Title IX complaints. What makes you have standing is that you're actually complaining about the misuse of federal tax dollars. You don't have to be a victim of that discriminatory program.
Yeah, we have actually used Title IX in the past to confront our movement has used Title IX in the past to confront various unjust laws, and it seems to be working. We seem to be making progress on it. But our real issue with Title IX boils down to pretty much kangaroo courts inside universities and colleges where you can be accused of basically anything, and if you're male, they will listen to pretty much just the woman, and you won't get to submit evidence at all. Sometimes it's whoever gets there first. Sometimes it's just the classic gynocentric gender component that they go with. But as far as we can tell, it is very, very unfair if you're accused of anything in these colleges. You typically don't get a lawyer. You don't get a lawyer, period. You often don't get to submit evidence. If you do get to submit evidence, they will freely ignore it. These are not experts who are dealing with your case. They are purely admin staff. So you are basically in front of a court staffed by the people who would clean the court typically. So you're that's the level of experience they have, or more accurately, they would be the ones who would do all the secretarial work and stuff like that. So
And so
it's can't hear a thing you're saying, Blue. You are basically in front of a Blue, all I can hear is my audio from your mic, Blue. I'm going to mute you. So you're that's the level of experience they have, or more. Sorry, for some reason we had a little loop there. I had to mute Blue. Anyway, would Title IX like to comment on what I've just said, because I know he's had experiences of this directly.
Yeah. So this bias appears all throughout the school's decision-making process. Like, I have filed some complaints with schools when I was originally starting this, and they are not successful. There is insane bias, even more than what you would see in OCR in terms of how that staff rules, because they're just not familiar with the law. Like when you write to Title IX or to OCR, attorneys handle it. When you write to the school, they don't, like, it's some random person they hired into the Title IX staff who does not have to have legal training or a degree. Like, it could literally just be a random person that they hire. So we see some of this bias occurring, and I think it's incentivized by how Title IX is enforced. So the only recourse the only penalty that OCR is technically allowed to enact for violating Title IX is revoking federal funding. Any other penalty has to be agreed to by the university. So universities always agree to the penalties because they don't want to lose their federal funding, which would include loans, grants, stuff like that. And what this produces is because OCR is a political agency, it's under the executive branch, it's subject to political winds and popular opinion. So when schools are ruling in Title IX cases, whether it's just generic gender discrimination or sexual harassment, they have an incentive to align themselves with popular opinion and not the law, because they don't want to run afoul of OCR and lose federal funding. So there's a conflict of interest when they're ruling on these issues. So if I complain to a school that they're discriminating against men, it's in their interest to say no, that they're not. Because one, they don't want to say that they're engaging in discriminatory activity. They're not going to say, yeah, we're committing civil rights violations. And it goes against popular opinion to say that they're doing that against men. So they're incentivized to rule in a biased way. There's an irreducible conflict of interest in having schools make these rulings themselves. It just can't be solved. This is something that should be delegated to the courts or to the federal government and should not be placed in the hands of the school. I think that is a dramatic misstep of Title IX and its application. And courts have even recognized recently, they've officially recognized this as a bias in how the schools operate. And in 2019, I will copy this into the Friday text chat. There's this case, and I will give a quote of the court. And I'll read it out loud here. It said, while girls historically have been underrepresented in high school athletics over the past 5 years, oh, wrong one. Apologize. Let's delete that. Okay. Sorry, it was 2018 Doe versus Miami University. And the court said that statistical evidence that shows a pattern of gender-based decision-making and external pressure on Miami University supports the motion to dismiss stage a reasonable inference of gender discrimination. Nearly 90% of students found responsible for sexual misconduct between 2011 and 2014 have male first names. So the court even recognized that the school was applying these things differentially and used that to support the complainant's lawsuit against Miami when Miami was trying to dismiss it. The court said, yeah, like the statistical evidence shows that you are biased in how you're applying this. So we're going to assume that there is likely to be bias in the decision-making process that leads to these outcomes. And so they upheld it. And so courts are starting to take notice of this issue, but OCR has been pretty reluctant to adopt a lot of the things that the courts have ruled. I mean, even in one document OCR published about justifications for discrimination, they unironically allowed the preference of the included class to justify continued discrimination against the excluded class. Like completely upending Brown v. Board. I mean, nobody would ever accept that it was acceptable for the preference of white students at the time to maintain segregated schools as justifying continued discrimination. It's been resoundingly rejected, but OCR in their own policies still allows that as a justification. It's completely out of line. The Supreme Court has over time ruled that you need what's called a exceedingly persuasive justification for discrimination. That doesn't apply to just the program. It applies to how you decide to enact programs. So if you want to enact programs to increase diversity of women in STEM at your school, it's a violation if you don't implement diversity programs to fix other gender imbalances. Only choosing to apply these exceptions based on the gender it helps is a violation because the justification needs apply to your decision making. It doesn't just apply to the program. And I mean, you'll look across the board at universities. Tell me how many initiatives you have to get more men into nursing, education, social work. They don't exist. They're few and far between if they do.
I interrupt you really fast with something that I recall. I'll see if I can find an article on it, though you probably already know what I'm talking about. It was around 2009 or 2010-ish, so about 11 years ago or so. There was an investigation, the Department of Justice, I think, did an investigation on whether schools were accepting male applicants at a higher rate to try and even out the balance. And they very quickly had to stop when they looked at schools like MIT and saw that the female application acceptance rate was 3 times higher than the male acceptance rate. So at some schools they would find boys were being accepted at a higher rate, but at some schools they found that girls were being accepted at a higher rate, and thus they stopped the investigation. But you have to wonder, though, would there ever have been a concern at all if the only imbalance was more girls and boys being accepted? They only started to do an investigation when it was boys, or even the thought that maybe it's boys being accepted at a higher rate, even though boys were the minority to begin with. I just found that very, very telling, frankly.
The bias always seems to go one way, doesn't it? You never see this patriarchal boys club that they always talk about. It's always the other way around.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of the view regarding these programs and their legality is a carryover from when they were legal, when women were just entering, like really beginning to just enter and break down those barriers in higher education. These programs were legal because they were relevant to the time to promote women in colleges. That was something that was needed, and the courts don't like discrimination, and they're not going to uphold that it should be a permanent fixture of our social landscape. That these programs need to be I wouldn't say have a fixed time limit, but they need to be relevant to the time, and they need to be explicitly linked to overcoming a measurable deficiency at that institution, not society at large. So these schools implemented these programs to get more women enrolled, and now that women are the significant majority of students, these programs still exist. Nobody is doing their continual evaluations of relevancy like they should be. I mean, right now the gender gap in education is 50% worse than when Title IX was passed, but with the genders flipped. When it was the other way around and less of a gap, it got civil rights law passed in the United States. Now that it's flipped at 50% worse, we can't even get OCR to talk about it. And it shouldn't be considered a big ask at this point to just have civil rights law applied equally and independent of the genders being impacted.
If I may, it's even worse than people don't want to talk about it. It's if you do talk about it, you're accused of misogyny and you're accused of being against women's education. So it's even worse than apathy. Feminists will go out of their way to defend the system as it is now. And I hate to make this about feminism, but I just have to add, this is an example of why MRAs often will say feminism does not do enough to address men's issues, and in fact sometimes works to perpetuate men's issues or make them even worse. You won't see any major mainstream feminist organization or figure have the conversation that we're having right now. So it's an example of why the MRM needs to exist and why we do find ourselves at odds with feminists so often. What major feminist organizations, and this is a rhetorical question to anybody watching this right now, jump on Google and find out. Show me what feminist organization or figure is talking about what we're talking about right now and how to fix it. The answer is good luck finding somebody. Maybe you will, but good luck.
Another thing that I would like to add is that, the problem with it just being with Title IX being upheld and basically whether or not the laws get enforced just by the schools is that if they're, not to get political, but I'm gonna, if like for a lot of Democratic, based school, a lot of blue run based schools, they'll have different rules. And then for a lot of Republican, based schools, they'll have different rules whenever it comes to, different issues and, delivering their policies and stuff like that. So that's why, that can be a big problem. And that's why it should be with the federal government as a whole instead of, with the schools, because there could be, I'm just saying, like, politics could play out, and that could definitely swing the rules a lot differently.
Yeah, absolutely. And a good example of this is how universities decide to define their diversity initiatives. So, and another complaint I'm working on at the moment, a university only has their diversity and inclusion mission, including gender, in the departments and programs where men are the overrepresented gender. But you go and look at the stats for their programs, and 4 out of 5 of the largest gender gaps at that university show women as being overrepresented. And then even at a whole, women are the marginally overrepresented gender across the university. But all of a sudden, the moment it's coming to women being overrepresented in, say, nursing or social work, that gender component to the diversity inclusion statement just disappears. It's no longer a factor. And so it's a pretty biased view of what diversity and inclusion is. And in fact, this university for Women's Month had said that they're actively working on recruiting and enrolling more women. Their staff is majority women already. So, like, what are you doing? There's no exceedingly persuasive justification for that. It doesn't exist anymore, and it's no longer relevant to the times. It's a legacy carryover from when those things were legal, and people just continue to assume they are legal because they're not trained. They don't even. I don't even think that half of them have read Title IX. I came across a school that had it was a class that was 4 credits. It auto-enrolled all freshman female engineers, and it was a women-only class. And the school told me that it was not a violation of Title IX. That's when I stopped filing with schools.
Hold on, could you highlight that a little bit more? Because did you say that they were getting an extra credit class specifically for their gender?
Extra credit isn't the right word. It was a freshman orientation class that helped introduce you to mentors and the resources and stuff like that at the university. And it auto-enrolled freshman female engineers, and it was required, and it was women only. And the school told me it was not a violation of Title IX. My FOIA request for documents said that internally they did recognize it as a violation. They just ruled that it wasn't because, men.
So they weren't misguided. They were being intentionally dishonest.
Yeah, and they told me it wasn't a violation, and then they went and changed the program to be gender inclusive. Yep.
So after you had raised the issue, that triggered them changing the language.
Yep.
So they must have recognized something, or else they would not have felt the need to make said changes.
Yeah, and the class still says it's women focused, or it's focused on doing this for women. So even if you're a guy that attends, you can still assume that you wouldn't equally benefit from the program.
There's like a shame. There's like a shame factor too.
Yeah.
So I definitely want to interview you on my channel. I know you said before you wanted to do that because this is something that's very relevant now, and this is something you can get a lot of traction with. I think with college students, especially with the college gap being what it is. I'm going to be driving in a bit, guys, so I'm going to be here most listening, but.
And another on the same topic, another really interesting one I just filed was against. In fact, it got assigned case numbers, I think, yesterday. Was against the state of Texas and their university system that's called the Texas. I think it's the Texas Women's University. And it's despite the name leading you to believe it's for women, it's actually coeducational. Both men and women are allowed to attend. And in late September 2021 was when a particular law that they passed, a state law they passed, went into effect that said that this university system was women focused, and that is a violation of Title IX. And the state put it into law that this was the case. The brazenness of these violations is only occurring because there's a complete lack of enforcement. There's no penalty to doing it. So what does civil rights laws matter if they're not enforced? And they won't be enforced unless we write complaints. And universities go out of their way to obscure a lot of the data that shows like that they're non-compliant. And
so
a lot
of it's almost like you're damned if you do and you damned if you don't.
Mm-hmm. And like in filing complaints, you're going to have issues with OCR's bullshit dismissals and stuff. But like each one of those is kind of a notch in the belt that, over time, if we collect enough of those, we can show a bias pattern in OCR. The fact that they're more likely than not to dismiss cases on bullshit grounds is, it shouldn't be a deterrent for us filing. It still serves a purpose, even if it isn't what we were actually complaining about.
Is OCR an organization?
OCR is there's technically a lot of OCR groups. There's one for pretty much every, I think, federal organization. But for when we say OCR in this context, we're talking about the Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights, who handles like Title IX complaints, racial complaints, disability complaints, stuff like that.
Okay.
Are there any other ways we can fight back against it and highlight this to the public? Because this is a gross civil rights it's just horrifying, the level of.
Is there any way? Sorry, is it possible to fight back against this without, in some way, shape, or form, fight against feminist groups?
I mean, I haven't written a complaint against any feminist groups. I've written complaints against illegal violations of civil rights laws. I mean, if an organization or group that says that they're for equality is standing in support of those, that's not really my problem, and I stand against that. I don't think that educational opportunities should be limited by gender, with a few exceptions. There's like physical contact sports and choir and stuff, but learning about astronomy or chemistry, like your gender shouldn't matter in whether or not you can attend to that program. And if you stand in my path of these complaints, you're on the wrong side of the law. I'm actually surprised that more feminist organizations aren't in support of that.
Sorry, I was just saying, is there any way we can raise a civil case against this? Like some sort of class action lawsuit or something?
Absolutely. If that requires money, going to courts and gets expensive quick, which is part of the reason that the Office of Civil Rights exists and why federal agencies have them, is that it's understood that the people that are being discriminated against often don't have a lot of financial means or political power and might not have the ability to take it to court. So these federal agencies exist as sort of a runaround of needing to do that. That their attorneys then go and take that, and it'll be the federal government versus the school. And if the school doesn't want to agree to a voluntary resolution, OCR can and will take it to actual courts and bring the school to task. But you're not required to file with OCR or the school. You can just go right to the court if you want. It can be class actions, things like that. Absolutely.
So, do you think we've got enough evidence at this point to launch a class action? Because that might be something that we could look into, perhaps.
I don't know if there's enough to. Well, against individual universities, it's certainly something that can be done. I don't think that there's likely to be enough evidence against OCR at this point. It really would require like a more thorough documentation and a lot of really good examples of egregious bias, not just little bias and like, hey, I made a small complaint and they dismissed it. Just like absolutely absurd bias, like that case I was talking about where OCR dismissed it without even referencing laws having informed their opinion. After a senior attorney spent a year and a half on it, and that was politically motivated. The dismissal came slightly after the Democrats put I'm trying to remember her name, Lehman, I think, back as the assistant secretary, basically overseeing OCR. And shortly after that is when they issued the dismissal. Like prior to that, the senior attorney thought this case was going to have high public visibility and was working with DC on the case due to that. And they were looking at because I was impacted by this case, they were looking at monetary damages and things like that for me, and that just all evaporated. Like part of the issue with that case was that the school, when I started writing these complaints, didn't realize that I was a student, and they said I got their internal emails via a FOIA request, and it was revealed that like right after I filed a bunch of these complaints, that the school was like was interested in reaching out to all of the members of administration that I might contact regarding these cases, and right after that, my emails started going to spam, which included documents that I was sending to my advisor that he needed to sign so that I could graduate. So I missed graduation because of this. And shortly after, the internal emails show that they had finished contacting all of the administration, and they were confident that they had informed all of them about the case that was going on. That's when my emails stopped going to spam. And OCR like just ignored this in the dismissal, didn't even mention it. And so those are the kinds of cases we need to document and use as evidence for possibly an eventual class action against OCR's bias. It's pretty hard to dispute at that point.
Would you like to comment on the situation with the laws that Trump instituted and that Biden cancelled, or is that next week's topic? I forget.
That's more along the lines of next week's topic. Even our government seems to ignore the gender discrimination side of Title IX that doesn't include sexual harassment. Looking at these programs and these issues is not something that's on their radar, something that they care about. Same with OCR. When OCR released their COVID-19 report, it was on the topic of how COVID-19 had impacted certain demographics of students, and they didn't mention men anywhere in there. Well, I guess technically twice. Once was in an info dump, and another time was saying that there were pre-COVID disparities in enrollment or that enrollment was dropping for both men and women before COVID. The the data that they reference for that was actually about men's massive drop in attendance compared to women and how it's accelerating. And OCR's level of discussion was it's impacting both. I mean, men were 78% of the total number of students lost due to COVID, like lost enrollment due to COVID. And men only make up 42% of the student body. So if OCR is talking about differential impact of COVID, how could they not discuss that at all? It's an intentional bias, and it's leaving men out of the conversation of impact. And we even see that in how they're trying to revise Title IX regulations. It's not considered an issue for them that men are being discriminated against in these programs.
Yeah, the preferential treatment, it just always shocks me. I mean, why? Why be so preferential? It must be, we do have quite a lot of evidence that it's part of human instinct. But even so, people looking at these statistics and saying, okay, men have this and women have that, and so on and so forth, they shouldn't really be as like biased as they are, even considering all the things we know. They should at least, be talking about, oh, we've lost a lot of paying customers due to COVID, and we should probably talk about that. It's one thing to be biased against men and to not want to talk about men being hurt by their kangaroo courts. But it's quite another to say, okay, we have lost the vast majority of one gender of our customers. What's going on here? Shouldn't we have a report about this?
And getting our voices heard and adding to that national discussion can be done by filing complaints. I mean, OCR has to respond to the complaint in some way, shape, or form. They can't just ignore that you filed. And so if we're not filing, it says to OCR that these things aren't issues. And if they are, it's not something that the impacted class cares about. And so it's not going to be something that OCR cares about. But if men start filing and we start raising a little bit of a ruckus over it, they can't ignore it. They have to start doing something. And if they don't, we have a pretty good case for bias, for proving bias in OCR. So somebody said I should talk about a case. This one case I'm working on. It's going to be my biggest case I've filed so far, and it's currently out to a couple of people for edits and review. And it's against a university that for at least 25 years now has run a whole heap of women-only programs. And in 27, what makes this interesting is that in 2017 and 2018, OCR issued resolutions against this school due to how poorly trained their OCR staff were. That like OCR was even recognizing that their staff are totally fucking incompetent. Sorry, swearing. But like it was that bad that OCR themselves recognized this, and so OCR, as part of the resolution, was requiring the school to allow OCR to review the training and credentials of all of their Title IX staff to assure that they're properly trained. So there's no argument that can be made that their staff aren't properly trained. The organization that oversees this affirms this. The school has affirmed this. But yet the school's still using flagrant violations in their advertising materials. They even have a professor being quoted stating that they have gender quotas in his laboratories and like project groups. And they're using advertising materials that still say these programs are only for women. So it presents an interesting scenario where there have been resolutions already that the school is still failing to comply with Title IX. Independent of those resolutions. They can't argue that the staff aren't well informed. So this now presents criminal allegations. The Title IX staff have to assure the government that they're in compliance in order to get this funding. So the Title IX staff that are properly trained should be aware of these violations because they're using them in advertisements, and they're lying on federal forms still saying that they're in compliance. That is criminal fraud.
I'd also like to bring up the school you're talking about. I know which school it is. They also offer a lot of transfer programs to other schools in the area and a lot of the community colleges. And those transfer programs also have a lot of very biased advertising about their women-only program and some of the special things women can take at their school and special things women can do through the transfer program and special scholarships that they'll get through the transfer program only for women.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I think in that complaint I allege over I think it's about like over 230 instances of violations, in addition to criminal violations, and violations of past resolutions with OCR. And at what point do we think that the law no longer has teeth to enforce itself? And I think that in this case, there is substantial argument that OCR should pull funding from this school. They've had multiple chances to get compliant. Their staff are technically well trained. So at this point, they're just in obstinance of the law and show no indication that they intend to ever be compliant. It absolutely warrants revocation of federal funding at that point. You can't stand for over 24 years in obstinance of the law with multiple opportunities to fix yourself and still claim that you are willing to be compliant with the law. It doesn't make sense. So I'm interested to see. As of yet, Title IX has never resulted in revocation of federal funding from a college or university. And I'm interested to see if this might be the case that prompts that to happen. It's a little bit of an incendiary topic. A lot of people would be impacted, but the argument's there and has the potential for media attention that can bring some of these issues into the spotlight and get the media and the government discussing these problems.
And if not,
Yeah,
it
I
would be
think-
a case we could use against OCR to start proving.
Absolutely. I mean, you can't look at this and say that there isn't a problem. And so if OCR just requires changes to the programs, that's insufficient. And if they dismiss it, that's a very, very clear indication of bias. And if they don't address the issue of people lying on federal forms, it's a passive green light that it's okay for universities to do this. And I don't really trust OCR on that enforcement side. And because there's criminal allegations, it's also going to be submitted to the Department of Justice. They will have jurisdiction over that, and they're significantly more beholden to the law than political winds of OCR are.
You know what might be useful is if we were able to get some sort of sting operation on this, some sort of undercover footage, stuff like that. It might be useful trying to contact Project Veritas or some other similar organization which does a lot of undercover work. I'm not sure if they would take something like this because they seem to be.
Probably would. They probably would. I actually could get a hold of somebody who knows somebody that is part of that. So maybe we could.
More organizations are
If you could put us in
definitely
touch
needed.
with them, please do.
And you don't have to be a legal expert or even incredibly well informed on Title IX to get active. I mean, dropping me a DM, I have the same username on Reddit, mra.title9. Like dropping me a DM on Discord or on Reddit with some emails that were sent out from your university, pictures of flyers, things like that helps a lot. A lot of these violations are like what I'm filing against is only what's publicly available. It's just the tip of the iceberg at these universities. And the students themselves are best positioned to see the bulk of these violations. There was a violation at another school where they were running a job fair and it had limited seats. And when you went to go apply, the final question was, are you a female? Are you a female engineering student, or are you a female student in STEM? And the buttons were yes and no. And next to no, it said, please do not apply. We prioritize women in STEM. This was for a job fair. And there's no way that I would have been able to find that if I wasn't a student at that university. And so the most damning evidence of violations are only ever going to be available to students. And so simply passing that along to somebody that can file, that's used to that, is incredibly helpful.
So, from my perspective, a lot of this seems to be issues of emergent phenomenon that are resulted from the engineered manipulation of semantics. So basically, people are changing what words actually mean in order to make people interpret the words and speech that they use in different ways. For example, there's a common phenomena of the fact that sexism, you can't be sexist against men, despite the fact that if you actually take the fundamental definition of sexism, then it's merely the generic bias when relative to sex. And then this is also abusing the inherent of there can't be an end if there isn't a start. So they're relying on people not causing a problem so that they don't actually have to deal with a problem.
Exactly. And their flippant use of alternative definitions also extends to interpreting case law. An example that I've been working with and crafting arguments specifically to explain the topic is in regard to the use of gendered language in program titles and descriptions. And so courts had ruled that, I think it was women's studies, is not a violation of Title IX because studying the works of women is a legal topic for education. And therefore, women's studies correctly describes what's being studied, and what's being studied is legal. Therefore, the title's legal, and that makes sense, right? Like you can have a men's basketball team, and you can call it a men's basketball team because they're legally allowed to discriminate based on sex. But the case law doesn't support that gendered language can be used when what it's describing is illegal. The compliance of the title is received by the compliance of the program, not the other way around. So when you call something a women's astronomy camp, but technically allow everyone to attend, that should still be a violation because you're talking about the gender of the participants, and what you're talking about is illegal to take action to create. New Jersey, is it New Jersey? So Rutgers runs a hackathon called Hackers, and they describe it as New Jersey's first all-female hackathon. But they technically allow our largest all-female hackathon. But they technically allow anybody to attend. And OCR dismissed that case, saying that gendered language is allowed to be used in titles and descriptions, even though what they're describing is illegal. And that's a complete misinterpretation of case law. They're taking what the courts have said and intentionally misinterpreting it as a basis for dismissing men's cases.
Like Sheila's Wheels in the UK, where they, I think if I recall rightly, they allowed anyone to join up, but they advertised exclusively to women, saying that women are the safer drivers, which is, as far as I'm aware, a statistical error that they were kind of relying on. Because women don't drive anything like as much as men, and they don't drive they don't do as many driving jobs where you're on the road for hundreds and hundreds of hours. So they have fewer accidents as a whole, but it's it's entirely based on errors like that. I think we haven't really discussed it much because, well, I don't think it's a very well known problem in the community, but it's why you have higher rates of insurance for men over women.
The U.S. Supreme Court ruled on a case pretty similar to that, along the same lines, in 1976, and if I remember right, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, she wasn't a Supreme Court justice at the time, wrote an amicus curiae brief to the Supreme Court that was pretty influential in support of the court finding discrimination. And this was a men's case. So Oklahoma at the time had an important government objective, that's a legal term, of increasing road safety. And men were more likely to drive drunk than women were. So they raised the drinking age in Oklahoma from 18 for men to 21, but they left it at 18 for women. And the Supreme Court struck it down as discriminatory. And it's primarily centered on that the use of gender classification was only arbitrarily related to achieving the objective. That sure, the objective could be achieved by a discriminatory program, but it could also be achieved by setting the drinking age to 21 for everybody. And so just because discrimination can achieve your objective does not give you the legal right to enact those programs. Sure, we can make women the majority of people in STEM by not allowing men to enroll in STEM at all, right? But that would never hold up. If you can accomplish these objectives without discriminating, courts are very unlikely to find that you have a justification for discrimination. I think like one of the examples of where they did find gender to be a useful classification because a different one did not exist was there was an older case where there was like some special tax credits for women that were widows, a small couple $100 compared to men that were widows. And there was evidence that gender was a useful classification for economic impact. And because they didn't have a better way to measure it, it was allowed to continue. But in this case, there was no other way to slice that to achieve their goals. Whereas with the Oklahoma driving and alcohol age case, there was, and so it wasn't allowed. It applies to the decision-making process again. It's critical, and people always think it just applies to the program. It doesn't. So how can we enforce that kind of compliance without sort of some undercover operation, right, where people are involved with these Title IX staff and are blowing the whistle? We're not privy to the decision-making process of universities. We have to rely on what we see in public statements and in the development of these programs as evidence of that. No university is ever going to give you the evidence if you ask for it. They're supposed to be reviewing these programs, continually reviewing their justifications are currently relevant, but we're not privy to any of that. So how, as citizens, can we ensure compliance? It's nearly impossible on that front.
Yeah, I think this is why we really need to get somebody like Project Veritas involved. It's. I also think we could probably do quite a bit of awareness raising with leaflets in college campuses. So I could go and design a few leaflets that we could start putting up in September in colleges around the world. I I was thinking something along the lines of Title IX, you know, is violates civil rights laws or something. You'd have to give me the specific wording though, so it was accurate. I think because I think the way you phrased it was that it technically doesn't, but they use it in a way that does. So maybe it'd be something like the way that Title IX is being used violates civil rights law or something like that.
Well, what really needs to be done,
Which is probably why
honestly,
they want to get rid of civil rights law, to be honest.
Ma, I think what really needs to be done with your leaflet is it needs to explain Title IX in general. A lot of students in college don't really know anything about Title IX. They know what it is. And that's why we're talking about specifically the part about discrimination, because that's the other thing. A lot of students, when they think of Title IX, they only think about the portion of it that's related to sexual assault and harassment and rape, which has its own issues that we could save for a whole other episode. And so they don't know about the discrimination part and the fact that these programs they see all over their schools, community college, universities, wherever you're going, they don't realize those are discriminatory, those break Title IX, because they don't know that part of Title IX. They don't really know much about Title IX. So if we were to do a leaflet, it should be something informative.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just talking about the headline here. So, I mean, that would be the headline, and then you could possibly have a description of it. And then perhaps on, I'm thinking a folds out leaflet possibly. I'm not sure how much traction they get versus flyers, but that's something that we could definitely think about is what I'm saying. Perhaps even like a small poster that could go up on a notice board, giving people like a general overview and a link to a website talking about Title IX.
And
We should
this is
probably also get involved in. There's this website called the College Fix. They are a conservative site, but they do a lot of stuff related to Title IX that we could probably use as well.
this is getting eliciting more student involvement in this is absolutely critical right now because OCR has been considering amending their policies that they're not really going to give consideration or priority to cases where there's not a direct victim of discrimination. And that's because a lot of people there's a couple of people like me that have started activism for these programs that discriminate against men, and we're only the victims in the sense of misuse of tax dollars, not a direct victim of the discrimination. And so it's a way to shut out those cases and making it appear to be facially gender neutral as a policy. So getting students involved preempts that problem. We can say, hey, here are some people that were discriminated against. And this is just another instance of where OCR is going directly against Supreme Court rulings on how to determine discrimination. In 1977, there was a case, Teamsters versus United States. And I'll read a little quote here. They said, if an employer should announce, I'll also paste it. If an employer should announce his policy of discrimination by a sign reading "Whites Only" on the hiring office door, his victims would not be limited to the few who ignored the sign and subjected themselves to personal rebuffs. The same message can be communicated to potential applicants more subtly, but just as clearly by an employer's actual practices, by his consistent discriminatory treatment of actual applicants, by the manner in which he publicizes vacancies, his recruitment techniques, his response to casual or tentative inquiries, and even by the racial or ethnic composition of that part of his workforce from which he is discriminately excluding members of minority groups. When a person's desire for a job is not translated into a formal application solely based on his unwillingness to engage in a futile gesture, he is just as much a victim of discrimination as he who goes through the motions of submitting an application. So the Supreme Court in 1977 even recognized that you don't need to file these an application or attempt to enter these programs to claim that you're a victim of discrimination. if the program is dissuading you from attending because it says it's women only, or because it indicates that it's going to give preference to helping female students, you're still a victim of discrimination. You don't have to get that letter from them that says no. But OCR is trying to make that the case in terms of what they enforce.
Perhaps it'd be worth writing into them specifically with that Supreme Court ruling and explaining to them that what they're doing would be illegal. Then again, they don't seem to care about the other stuff, so why would they care about this? It's just the Supreme Court, after all.
That's the problem. It's really up to OCR, like who they give funding to and stuff, and the process of writing complaints and them handling them is, in a way, almost like a privilege in that you can still go to courts. So if OCR decides, hey, we're not going to enforce these couple of things, I think that they're technically allowed to do that. It's morally reprehensible, and they're basically saying, fuck you, you have to go to the court if you actually want enforcement of these policies.
So, to my opinion, a lot of this comes down to issues underneath it all, like principle issues. Probably the most famous example of this I can give is a quote by Gandhi: "An eye for an eye will leave the whole world blind." And people don't really understand exactly what he was trying to say, and where we're now experiencing the same kind of sexism that women were previously because they didn't actually deal with the fundamental issues that caused the sexism, the misogyny to exist in the first place.
Yeah, and there's two very relevant court cases.
There has always been sexism against men, and it has always been quite extreme. And it used to be that. Well, like I mean, I could just mention the draft. The draft's been ongoing forever, and men got the vote because they were drafted, and women wanted the vote, and they got it on the basis of just here you go. So it is kind of that sort of thing. We also have evidence that quite possibly back in the Victorian era, a man could go to prison for the crimes of his wife. We have 200 years of studies and things showing bias in sentencing and things like that. So it's, I don't think we should give them the kind of leeway where we say, oh, yeah, it's been flipped over and reversed so that now it's men getting the short end of the stick, when I'm pretty sure it was men getting the short end of the stick for pretty much the whole of human history, but also women got the short end of the stick in certain regards at certain times and things like that. I mean, I'm sure that there are plenty of women's issues that are legitimate, but I do think that it's more a case that women have gained so much ground they've left men behind, rather than any sort of flipping of the discrimination. Because if we say it's flipping, then we are saying that men used to oppress women, when that was never the case.
On the topic of what Dark Wolf was saying, there are two critical cases where the Supreme Court has issued rulings related to that. One was in Brown v. Board, that very famous educational civil rights case where the Supreme Court forced desegregation in schools. They recognized that discrimination creates an invidious environment no matter where or when it occurs, that it will always precipitate prejudice and bias and resentment in the excluded class. And so this led to interpretation that we need to be really careful about when we actually allow violations of the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, that we have to recognize when instituting these discriminatory programs that they will foster awful atmospheres. So they can't be around forever. And that's why they have to always be relevant to the current times. You can't continue having like these anti-male discrimination policies that favor women when women are the majority of students. It's no longer relevant. The other case was trying to remember right. Basically, I'm historical. Right. So that's in 2019 it was DM versus Minnesota State High School. They said that while girls historically have been underrepresented in high school athletics, over the past 5 years, the representation of girls in Minnesota high schools is almost directly proportional to their enrollment. The defendant has not shown, therefore, that the underlying problem they sought to remedy by creating all-girls teams, underrepresentation of girls in athletics, continues to exist in Minnesota. So it's found to be discriminatory, that it was no longer justified now that equal representation has been obtained. And this can be applied to all these other discriminatory programs. This was not a small case. You can show, hey, women are not underrepresented anymore. You can't have these blanket pro-women initiatives. So previously, like when women were underrepresented, they could have and only apply diversity initiatives to women in STEM. But now that they're not now that they're no longer underrepresented, you can't justify that. So it violates an even-handed requirement where now if you want to introduce these diversity initiatives that help women, you can't do that anymore without also instituting diversity initiatives that help men in programs that they're equally underrepresented in. Schools have not been taken to task on correcting these deficiencies yet.
We've actually seen them do like the reverse, where they will basically, I can't remember what specific subject this was in. I think it was actually in the government of one of the Scandinavian countries, where they had a specific quota for women, and they basically, after they topped out the quota, they had some sort of thing where it's like, okay, now we've got like 60% women, 70% women, so we had better like fix this. And so they made it so that they didn't have to enforce a quota the other way around. And I believe their government is now well, I can't remember exactly what part of their government this was for, but it was some sort of I'm sorry, but Blue will probably know what I'm talking about if he's still on. But basically, they removed the requirements that they balance things out so they could keep it unbalanced. I'll see if I can get this up on Google.
I feel that a lot of this has to do with our archaic concepts, particularly in this case, relevant to sex. I mean, if you're a man or you're a woman, that's largely irrelevant to anything other than the probability of genetic expressions. You know, I'm a man, but that doesn't mean that there aren't women that are stronger than I am.
While Maud's still looking that other piece up, I'll mention that how to phrase this. schools have really, in light of Bostock v. Clayton County, that 2020 Supreme Court ruling that determined that gender identity and sexual orientation are included in the definition of sex in civil rights law. Schools have started revising a lot of these to like women-only programs, and to now include transgender people or like gender non-conforming, non-binary and stuff. And their limitations and show of preference for particular students really showed their hand in that it's not that they're pro-women, it's that they're anti-male. That they craft these to now be inclusive of everyone that's not male. Whereas before, when a lot of civil rights law was operating on an assumption of binary gender definitions, they just claimed it was to help women. And now with the revisions going on, it's really facetious to still try and claim that. It's literally we're just showing preference and in who goes to these programs as long as they're not male. Like Barnard College, in their women-only admissions policy, they now allow trans women, and you are allowed to continue at the college and get your degree, even if you're a woman that then transitions to being a man while at the college. Which is very interesting because the Supreme Court ruled in another case that when a women-only nursing school was allowing men to audit their classes, it fatally undermined any argument for discrimination. And so they were forced to allow men to attend their classes. And so in this instance, we can demonstrate that Barnard has allowed men, because trans men are men, to attend their classes. Therefore, their argument for discrimination in admissions is fatally undermined per previous Supreme Court rulings.
Well, I want to answer to your point a little bit. Having a man, there are obviously women strong. And in the fact that a lot of these programs, and it's not only Title IX, in general, our does not account for the situation, which led to the creation of the Office of Civil Rights, which is very obviously not doing its job right. They don't account for it, and it's in all areas. It's in education, it's in finance, it's in jobs, it's all over. But Title IX specifically, obviously, it's education, and it's not accounting for certain situations. And as said earlier, a lot of it has to do with wording. If you can word things correctly, if you can word things certain ways, they get away with it. I'll keep certain things for the next episode on the other part of it. And then as said, it's also like financial. There's not a lot of situations capped, and everything's also grouped and stereotyped. If you've ever read studies done in colleges on student populace, there's a lot of stereotyping and there's a lot of grouping. And that becomes a problem because those studies then really aren't accurate, because it will show a result that could have a million different causes that are not. And they won't look into that. They're just only going to look at those. And so then you have situations, your example, let's say a guy was by female bigger than him, but that's not accounted for because the data shows differently based off stereotypical grouping. And that's the problem with a lot of these programs and a lot of the things they're instituting is the fact that it's based on data that's based on stereotyping and intersectionality theory as well, which if you search up is the idea of you have different groups and there are a lot of common factors that connect them. If you're this, you're also this, this, and that. which is basically just stereotyping. And using that system is not efficient and does more damage than good.
Exactly, and they rarely explicitly state these things as motivations for the discriminatory programs. And Justice Ginsburg herself even commented on this in 1996 in her opinion in a Supreme Court ruling. It was United States versus Virginia. She said that the justification must be genuine, not hypothesized nor invented post hoc in response to litigation. It must not rely on overbroad generalizations about the different talents, capacities, or preferences of males and females. But schools do this. They just, in their decision-making process, it's nearly impossible to enforce from an outside perspective.
Yeah, I think that I haven't been able to find the particular thing I was thinking of, but I do think it was actually Finland. In any case, I think this is probably enough for tonight because we are going to be doing a second stream on this next Friday with the topic of sexual discrimination in Title IX courts. So, Darkisha, if you could please take us out, that would be wonderful.
Sure. Thanks everyone for coming today. This has been the Men's Human Rights Server Friday chat. Thank you, MRA Title IX, for being here, being our guest, and informing us more about this issue. It was a pleasure having you. We are always here, 4 p.m. UK time, 10 a.m. Central, 11 a.m. Eastern, every Friday. If you ever have a recommendation for a topic, you can always message Men Are Human, Blue Orange, and myself. And we hope to see you all next week.
Thanks for having me.